The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's Thought Leaders webinar series, a webinar series featuring military leaders and contemporary military authors. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Vice President of Education, Lieutenant General Guy Swan.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Thought Leaders webinar series. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, and we are very glad that you've joined us and appreciate your support as partners in the defense of our nation. Joining us today to discuss his new book is Mr. James Kitfield, the author of In the Company of Heroes, the inspiring stories of Medal of Honor recipients from America's longest wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Also joining us today to serve as our moderator is General Dave Perkins, United States Army retired, former Commanding General of the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, and a senior fellow here at AUSA. For those joining us online, please take advantage of having Mr. Kitfield here to ask questions. You can use the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen to submit a question. After the discussion, General Perkins will be taking as many questions as time allows this afternoon. You can also find the full bios for both Mr. Kitfield and General Perkins at the Handouts tab. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to our moderator and good friend, General Dave Perkins, to tell us a bit more about today's guest. General Perkins, over to you, sir.
Thanks, Guy. Appreciate it. I have the unique honor and pleasure of introducing today's speaker and author, Mr. James Kitfield. A unique pleasure for me. I've known him for a while. I've had the pleasure of being interviewed by him, and I don't think there's really anyone out there today telling the story as well about America's newest, greatest generation. So we appreciate your ability to do that. Mr. James Kitfield is currently a senior fellow and journalist in resident at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and a contributing writer and former senior national security correspondent for Atlantic Media Company and National Journal. Mr. Kitfield's articles on defense, national security, intelligence, and foreign policy issues have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, Politico Magazine, National Journal, Bloomfield View, Yahoo News, Breaking Defense, Defense One, The National Interest, Daily Beast, The Hill, Newsday, and many other print and online publications. He is the only three-time recipient of the prestigious Journal Laura Ford Award for Distinguished Reporting on National Defense, most recently for his first-hand reporting on the Afghan War. The Military Reporters and Editors Association at the Medill School of Journalism have awarded Mr. Kitfield their top prize for excellence and reported an unprecedented 6 times. Most recently in 2016 in the online journalism category for his articles in Politico Magazine. Yahoo News and Breaking Defense and the National Press Clubs have honored him with its Edward Hood Award for Diplomatic Correspondence. Mr. Kitfield is the author of 3 previous books, including Prodigal Soldiers, War and Destiny, and Twilight Warriors, the soldiers, spies, and special agents who are revolutionizing the American way of war. He currently lives in Alexandria, Virginia. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to you, James.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Dave. I appreciate it. Hearing all of that makes me feel pretty old, actually. But I appreciate everyone being with us today and for the AUSA to host me for this event. I got the idea to write In the Company of Heroes while I was reporting on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq over many years for National Journal magazine. I was the senior national security correspondent. But I was covering it more for an audience of policymakers and lawmakers back in Washington, D.C. So talking mostly to generals and senior civilians about what the war plans were and were they going as anticipated, et cetera. But I was always extremely impressed by the young service members in uniform who I encountered, in some cases embedded with for months at a time. Just a really remarkable group of individuals. And I wanted to find some way to tell that story. And I got my opportunity when the Department of Navy gave me a call a couple of years ago and offered me an exclusive interview with who was then the most recent Medal of Honor recipient, Navy SEAL Britt Slavinsky. And in interviewing Britt, I was just, his tale of what happened to his SEAL team was just Homeric in its sweep. There was tragedy, it was heart-wrenching, but there was incredible courage. And I decided I wanted to tell more of the stories, and just to give you an idea of what that story was about. So Britt Slabinski is a SEAL team leader on the Battle of Anaconda in 2002, 2002, in the Hindu Kush, and they were going to be inserted as an Overwatch team. And as often happens in these stories, the smallest mistake sort of snowballed into a series of tragic errors. The schedule slipped a bit, so instead of being put on the middle of the mountain by the helicopter, they had to be where they could egress into their position silently, like the SEALs like to do. They instead were dropped off right at the top of the mountain. The helicopter is ambushed. They barely make it out of the ambush alive. The helicopter crash lands, and they realize one of their SEAL team members fell out in the ambush zone at the top of the mountain. So they get back to the base, and this young SEAL team leader in his mid-20s has to make this decision. He knows that going back up in that mountain, he's going to be outnumbered, fighting uphill in snowdrifts, and it's probably going to be a suicide mission. On the other hand, they still have their fallen comrade up there, Neil Roberts, who fell out of the helicopter. And this young Navy SEAL decides, okay, we're going back up to get him. I've got to do my best to live up to my creed, or we don't leave anyone behind. And all of his teammates shook their head and said, okay, that's what we'll do. Let's do it. Not one of them could have imagined that they would come back off that mountain alive. They did get ambushed again on the top of the mountain. John Chapman, who is the Air Force combat controller attached to the team, gets shot and is presumed dead. Another Navy SEAL gets shot in the leg. They have to egress off the mountain eventually. John Chapman, it turns out, from a drone, you realize that he wasn't killed. He was just knocked unconscious. He comes back into consciousness, fights again for 20 minutes on his own, wounded, I think, 9 times. And finally, the Quick Reaction Force helicopter shows up. He exposes himself to try to lay down cover for it, and he is killed. So these stories, if there's a common thread that goes through them, it is that when confronted with the most difficult moment of truth you could have in your life, this sort of what I write as a brush with eternity, every one of these individuals chose to do the extremely difficult and dangerous thing and put their lives at risk, and in some cases forfeit their lives to save their brothers in arms. And that was what inspired me so much about that story, and I wanted to tell more stories. And as I got into the stories, that moment of truth comes clear in each of these stories. And for Army First Sergeant Paul Smith, during the battle for the Baghdad airport, which I was very close to, as I know General Perkins was in those units that attacked the airport and then later Baghdad. But Paul Smith was in a small engineering battalion. They were just guarding a prisoner of war sort of courtyard where they have taken prisoners of war and putting them till the battle was over. And they get confronted with a Republican Guard counterattack that threatens to roll up the whole flank of the U.S. force that's fighting for the airport. So Paul Smith, while everyone else is retreating, jumps into an APC and mans a 50 caliber machine gun and holds basically the Republican Guard company at bay while his unit can regroup, and he's killed in that effort. But without his heroic effort, the whole flank of the U.S. force likely would have been exposed. Marine Corps Corporal Jason Dunham, Navy SEAL Michael Mansour, Army Private Ross McGinnis, and Army Staff Sergeant Travis Atkins all made the ultimate sacrifice by when a grenade or a suicide vest was confronted that was going to, hurt or kill their comrades in arms, they jumped on that grenade, sacrificing their own lives. Marine Corps Lance Corporal Kyle Carpenter, Army Ranger Ryan Pitts, and Army Captain Flo Groberg all made that same choice. They either tackled someone wearing a suicide vest or jumped on a grenade to save their comrades, but they lived and had to suffer through years of rehabilitation for really and extremely serious wounds. In some cases, Kyle Carpenter, I think, had 40 operations trying to piece himself back together. So it's a reminder that a lot of the bravery depicted in these stories happens far away from any battlefield. The Sergeant Bellavia, Army Sergeant Bellavia, was in the Battle of Fallujah. They're clearing a house. His unit is ambushed by machine gun emplacement inside the house. He exposes himself, lays down cover, so his comrades can get out the door and retreat. He comes out and then makes the almost unfathomable decision that he's going to go in alone and finish the mission of clearing that house. So that was his moment of truth, and he did it and had to take out a whole squad of Taliban fighters or Al-Qaeda fighters. Same for Lieutenant Michael Murphy, a Navy SEAL whose Overwatch team is exposed by two goat herders, Afghan goat herders. They're way behind enemy lines. They know that they let these goat herders go, they're likely to be tipped off. But he argues to his team successfully that we have to do the right thing here. We can't kill these innocent goat herders. And of course, they let him go, and they do tip off the Taliban. The whole Taliban, a whole major force of Taliban show up. They fight valiantly, but at one point, 3 of the 4 are badly wounded. They're lost their radio communication. So Mike Murphy says, I don't have a radio. I get into a clearing where I get cell phone reception, and he gets out into the clearing and knows that he's going to get killed, basically calls for reinforcements, and indeed is mortally wounded. So in each of these cases, there is a moment like that where they could have done the easy thing, the difficult thing, the honorable thing too. They went above and beyond the call of duty. And that comes through in all of these stories. Salvador Gunta, who I just saw, the AUSA has a great illustrated book on. His unit is ambushed in the Korengal Valley, and he fights through the ambush, goes to one of his wounded, and who says they took him, and he realizes that one of his best friends has been taken by the Taliban, who was wounded, has been taken by 2 Taliban fighters. He gives chase at night, goes right through the positions where the Taliban ambushed them, sees 2 Taliban dragging away his friend, neutralizes both those Taliban, and made sure that his friend spent his last hours on Earth amongst his friends who showed up and were giving him comfort as he lay dying. There was a Army Specialist Kyle White was going through an ambush alley stretch of the Hindu Kush. His unit is ambushed, and he is knocked unconscious by a rocket-propelled grenade. When he awakens, his whole unit has disappeared off the side of the mountain, it turns out. And there's a couple of wounded people of his teammates still up there. So he is under intense fire, constantly goes and treats the wounded, keeps the position from being overrun, and calls in close air support as well as a medevac, and is the last American off that mountain. And he was 20 years old when he did all that. Army Staff Sergeant Robbie Miller was a Green Beret walking point through a snowy forest at night when his unit is ambushed. His captain is killed, and they're trying to retreat, get out of the ambush, and the order is given to retreat. Instead, Robbie Miller goes forward into the teeth of the ambush to give his comrades time to get out of there, fights extremely bravely by himself for another 20 minutes until they hear his gun go silent, and he is killed. Army Green Beret Sergeant Matthew Williams and Combat Medic Ron Shore both received the Medal of Honor for their actions in the Battle of the Shock Valley. The actions of combat medics are really one of the key reasons why even those who are hurt badly in these wars are more survivable than previous wars, because these combat medics have become very expert at triaging and keeping these people alive, even with grievous wounds. And that was the case, even though the majority of the Green Berets were wounded, not one of them died, in large part because of Ron Shore's actions. Army Sergeant Ryan Pitts was on a position that was almost overrun by Taliban fighters. Everyone is either dead or severely wounded, and he fights on and keeps that position from being overrun, and saves the lives of the ones who are wounded and still able to receive help. So I want to get to the question and answer session, but I think you can see the common thread here. What's remarkable about these people is that when confronted with something, the hardest choice you'd ever make, to put your own life at forfeit to save your brothers in arms, each one of these extraordinary individuals decided they would risk their lives, and in some cases give up their lives to save their brothers in arms. And I find that extremely inspiring. These are heart-wrenching stories, and in many ways, very tragic stories, but they are inspiring stories, and that's why I wanted to write this book. And Dave, whenever you're ready, I'd like to go to questions.
Well, James, thank you very much for sort of running through really what are tip of the icebergs. If you get into the book, as a old soldier, I always find it very humbling to hear these stories, as well as grateful that our nation routinely produces people of this character that serve in our armed forces. I'll start off with the first question while we're getting some from the audience. And you discussed about why you wanted to write the book, basically because you were bored talking to generals, and I can relate to that. And so, you know, if you go about writing a book about Medal of Honor recipients, of course, you're going to expect stories of courage and great danger and, you know, heroic actions above and beyond. Was there anything that surprised you as you started doing the research about these heroes you spoke?
Yeah, there was, because as you said, I really went into it expecting the sort of these, you know, like you say, tales of extreme bravery and courage. But a lot of these stories really turn out to be about love and tenderness, and that did surprise me. But if you think about it, there's no greater love than being willing to jump on a grenade and take on your own body the blast that was meant for your colleagues. And same with Salvador Gunta, who, you know, chased down the Taliban at night to save his friends, even though he was so badly wounded he didn't survive the battle, but so that he would spend his last hours on Earth amongst his friends. And there, in all of these stories, there is, you know, there is that kind of deep love. I mean, I quote a Bible verse that says, you know, there is no greater love than this, that a person lay down his life for his friends. And I think that comes through really clearly in these stories, that these were actions born of love, and those tight bonds that developed between soldiers and sailors and Marines in combat. Those are steely bonds, and that's a pretty deep love.
Yeah, we have a question here from Rick, which is a great follow-on from this discussion. And what he asks is there a stereotypical, or is there sort of a mold that all these heroes fit into, or could anyone be a hero given the right circumstances?
It's a good question, and you know, I think I walked away with the conviction that these were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances finding out that there is a hero that lies beneath their skin. And so I would say you know, they come from all walks of life. They come from all corners of the country, all kinds of different circumstances. There were quite a few who were pretty decent athletes in high school. I think that was one common thread. But really, and this is what I find in some ways most inspiring about these stories, is these are not people who will be picked, you know, first in the draft. These are just what seem like, you know, ordinary people who, when confronted by this really extraordinary dangers in combat, do really extraordinary things. And I think that's one of the things I found most inspiring in these stories. Was it's not like, you know, these guys were picked for greatness. It was like greatness in some ways was thrust upon them, and they met the bar.
You know, when we look back, it seems that there has been a surprising number, if you want to call it double awards, or events where multiple awards, where two people in the same battle were recognized with the Medal of Honor, or certain battles tend to generate a number of awards. And in fact, the one you discussed with Sergeant First Class Smith, I know that same day, I know of another Distinguished Service Cross, a number of Silver Stars, Purple Hearts. Did you find that to be the case? And was there anything that precipitated that trend, would you say?
Well, it was definitely the case. I think in previous wars, it was extremely rare for to have two Medal of Honor recipients from the same battle. And in this book, there's at least three, I think, cases where two Medal of Honor recipients came from the same battle. And I think it gets to the point of just how intense some of this combat was. I think, you know, I had a good friend who's a retired general who say, in reading these stories, I'm almost embarrassed to say that I didn't realize this went on, because unless you're at the tip of the spear, it's lost, I think, on a lot of us. It was certainly lost on me that there was these intense combat going on. The Battle of Fallujah was the most intense urban combat the U.S. military had confronted since the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in 1968. The Hindu Kush mountain campaign was, it was totally an infantryman's war, dismounted infantry fighting dismounted infantry, extremely fierce, terrible, some of the most inhospitable places on earth, hard to get medevacs in to take the wounded out, hard to get extraction out in some cases, overwhelmed units who were facing larger numbers of Taliban fighters fighting on their home turf. So that campaign particularly created some of the most, harrowing battle scenes I've ever heard of. So I think these were very intense wars at their peaks, and extremely fierce battles. And I think that's why you see so many Medal of Honor recipients come out of them.
When we look through the history that you've recounted through in the beginning of the book about the medal itself, the global war on terrorism is obviously our most recent conflict that has produced a number of awards. And before that, when you take a look at numbers of awards, you're starting to look at Vietnam, Korea, World War I and II. So this one is unique from those in that this is with the all-volunteer force, and all those previous conflicts were some type of conscription. Do you think now having an all-volunteer force, has it affected the process of going through determining who receives a Medal of Honor?
I don't think it's affected the process so much. I do think that if you go back to Vietnam, there were, I think my recollection is more than 200 Medal of Honor recipients from Vietnam, and just 25 from these two wars over 20 years. And so I think that there was a sort of a stinginess, and it may have something to do with the fact that at a certain point, these wars lost their public support. And but I know when General Mattis came in as Secretary of Defense, he asked the services to go back and look at their awards and see if there were Medal of Honor recipients out there that should have gotten the Medal of Honor versus a Distinguished Service Cross or a Silver Star. And I commend him for that. You make an interesting point about the all-volunteer force, and that was one of the main reasons I wanted to write this book, is kind of as a homage to the all-volunteer force. In my first book, Prodigal Soldiers, I detail at great length the creation of the all-volunteer military in 1973, and it was designed to, quite honestly, to sort of circumvent all the anti-war protests that were happening that were driving President Nixon crazy. And I can tell you from having done the research that the architects of the all-volunteer force could never have imagined that we would send it off to fight the nation's two longest wars without reinforcing it with the draft. They just could not have conceived of that. And now I know the reasons we didn't do that, and we can go into them if anyone's interested, but there were some repercussions from that. The all-volunteer force is a pretty small force, and when you have two wars going on at the same time, that caused them to the volunteers in the force to go back to combat deployment after combat deployment after combat deployment, knowing that puts huge strains on families. So there was an epidemic of divorce, knowing that it increases your likelihood that you'll confront post-traumatic stress issues if you go back constantly to different combat deployments. There's been this whole epidemic of suicide that we've confronted. So we had stop loss, where people had, who had fulfilled their obligation had to go back to war because their units needed them. So there was a lot of repercussions from that. And I've had a general tell me he thinks that the reason that these were our longest wars is because there weren't the anti-war protests that you saw in earlier wars when there was a draft and you were pulling the sons and daughters of the middle class into uniform. So the military would never go back from an all-volunteer force. It's just too good. It's, having a professional military in a very technocratic age, it really almost demands a professional force. But I think we should be very clear about the burden that the 1% of volunteers had to shoulder during our longest wars. And I wanted to help tell that story. And this comes through very clearly in these stories of these remarkable Medal of Honor recipients, because these are not just stories of individuals. They're stories of teams and units of volunteers who band together, and in many cases volunteered after 9/11, knowing they were going into combat. And it's one of the reasons why I think a lot of the military leaders consider them the new greatest American generation.
You know, as you spoke with some of the Medal of Honor recipients, and did you get any discussions of, like, at the moment that they did their courageous acts that resulted them receive the Medal of Honor? What was going through their head? Was it spontaneous? Was it deliberate thought? In other words, you know, is there something we can bottle and you know, pass on to other folks? What was their thought process for some of these just unbelievably courageous acts?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, David. And it varies, because obviously someone who jumps on a grenade or sees someone with a suicide vest and tackles them, that's a split-second decision. But they've already, in all these cases, I think, have already thought through what they would do if. And so it's a split-second decision, but they've thought about it. And you know, which makes it all the more remarkable they chose the path they chose, to basically sacrifice their lives so their brothers in arms might live. In other cases, like with Britt Slavinsky, I mean, he had a couple of hours to think about, am I going to go back up on that mountain and try to retrieve my fallen SEAL, or which might sacrifice my whole team or not. And he had and he was an Eagle Scout, and he fell back, he told me, while he was making that decision, and he had to make it with the helicopter running and the fuel was being expended. And so they had to make it fairly quick when it came right down to it. And there was the old Eagle Scout mantra that I'm gonna muff up here, but it was something to the effect of, I on my honor, I agree to do my duty. And he didn't feel like he had done his duty to the extent possible to find Neil Roberts, who was the SEAL who fell out. So it varies. In some cases, it's very deliberate time. You have to decide what you're going to do. And in some cases, just a split second. But I would maintain that most of these people had thought about what they would do, and had steeled themselves that they would do the extremely honorable and brave thing.
You know, it's having said that, it's really a challenge to leaders when you think about it, to develop a sense of camaraderie, the esprit de corps in your unit, and the environment where people basically, without really giving it a long, deliberate second thought, immediately, without hesitation, are going to jump on a hand grenade or put their life on the line for somebody else. That's a huge responsibility for a leader to develop that in an organization. You know, as you took a look, and many of these were, as you said, very seriously injured and required multiple medical procedures after they returned. Was there any commonality in the way they approached dealing with the wounds and a recovery period, which was much longer than the initial action that they had in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because you know, for I think a lot of people, those wounds would have defined you and would have broken you. I think they would have broken me, be quite honest with you. But and for instance, in Kyle White's Carpenter's position, yeah, he used it as sort of a positive inflection point. He became sort of a warrior philosopher. He's a public speaker. He has a Twitter account, hashtag Chicks Dig Scars. I mean, he's just an amazing individual, and he used it as a positive. In Flo Groberg's case, he told me that he was about to go insane with survivor's guilt, because he lost a couple of 4 people very close to him in the suicide bombing. And he was approached in Walter Reed by another triple amputee who was, trying to recover his life, and that person told him, "Look, I know you're feeling down, you're depressed, but there are people here who have it even worse than you." And Groberg says that turned his life around. It helped him find his inner warrior, and he started acting like a warrior again to try to get through this horrible period of his life and to reclaim a life on the other side. So there's lots of inspiration that happens in these stories that, like I said, that's far away from any battlefield. And there's individuals who, through the worst, they use the worst day of their lives as an inflection point to be better people, which is pretty amazing in its own right.
And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think if you look at the post 9/11 Medal of Honors, many more of them seem to have been awarded in Afghanistan than Iraq. Do you think that's just a function of time? Is it a function of number of forces there, or did you see any trend between those two conflicts?
Well, and it's probably a better question for you, Dave, since you fought, in the Iraq War. I mean, that initial phase was very intense, a lot of intense combat. You know better than almost anyone. But it did settle into a situation where you were driving around in armored vehicles a lot and getting hit by IEDs, and which is terrifying, and it terrified me to do that. But what Afghanistan devolved into was, like I said, a war of dismounted infantry, where you're eyeball to eyeball with the other guy, and using, personal weapons. And that, I think, creates an environment where some of these heroic acts, it comes almost more naturally. In essence, it's kind of like hand-to-hand combat. It's your eyeball to eyeball dismounted infantry. So I think that's probably explains why there's more of them from Afghanistan, but certainly some, the Battle of Fallujah was a hellacious battle. And that was dismounted infantry as well in many cases. And in many cases, the special forces were engaged in dismounted infantry for 20 years. So there's a fair amount of Navy SEALs and Green Berets and Air Force combat controllers who are special forces as well, because those guys have been fighting wars of dismounted infantry for, like I said, going on 20 years, and many of them have combat deployments in the double digits.
As most of them, I'm not sure, you would probably know, I should, if there are any still serving, while most have transitioned. How have the transitions gone? Is it a wide variance, or are there some commonalities in the transition process from active duty to the next phase of their life?
A number of them who I talked to have transitioned just fine, and some have gone, as you said, back to the battle. I know Navy SEAL Ed Byers went back to the battle. I think I just recently read that he recently retired, but after the being in the arc lights of the Medal of Honor ceremony at the White House, he put back on his camos and slunk back into the shadows to where the Navy SEALs like to operate, and kept going. And some of them have gone on to, Leroy Petrie loses a hand in his battle where he received the Medal of Honor for, and he went back to another deployment in Afghanistan. So I think it runs the gamut, Dave. They're all sort of interesting individuals. And then, like I said, some people have gone on to be motivational speakers. It kind of runs the gamut.
As we said during the introduction, I mean, you've been with and written extensively about the U.S. military. As you've talked to folks, not only on this book, but on the others, and had discussions with them, and you're actually writing and capturing the stories and all that, are there any parts of serving in the military that sort of that thought process is a challenge to you, as we look at, a often used term now as civil military gap? Are there things that sort of are hard for you to understand?
I've been doing this for so long that it's any big issue like that I've written a lot about, and certainly civil military affairs I've written extensively on. I think that one of the reasons why the U.S. military always comes out as the most respected institution in this country is because of its nonpartisan basis. And I think that's incredibly important for the military to retain that. And it gets harder and harder in these hyperpartisan times. And we've seen that in recent years, where both sides want to drag the military in and either use them as a wedge or beat the other side over the head with the military. And and that's just wrong, and we shouldn't do that, because really it's critical that the military retain its nonpartisan ethos. I know that the last few secretaries of defense and chairman of the Joint Chiefs are determined that it will be the case, but it is getting harder and harder. And I feel for senior military leaders who are trying to keep the military out of the fray, for instance, when they're sent to the southern border, or presidents want to use them to quell domestic disturbances, et cetera. I think that's the wrong place for the active duty military. And I commend the leadership for trying their best to keep the military out of these hyperpartisan political debates that we're having in this country this time.
As we are here discussing today, and as you've written in your books, and there's been various TV and movies done about some of these incidences and servicemen and women. In your discussions with them, has that ever come up about how they are portrayed or how their actions are portrayed? And what kind of responses have you received, either from them or from their families, about how their servicemen or women or the actions are portrayed in media?
A lot of them have written their own books, and I always, I use those books in here, and I always quote those books. So some of them are really very, very good. I mean, cite one obvious example: Lone Survivor, Marcus Luttrell, who was Lieutenant Mike Murphy's he was the only person to survive in that SEAL Overwatch team. But there are a lot of Flo Groberg wrote his book. So did there's a lot of them have written their own books, and I think most of the Hollywood depictions have gone from those books. So I think they've been pretty realistically and favorably depicted. I haven't heard anyone complain that that was I was made to look bad, et cetera. That I have not run into.
Well, that's reassuring. We had spoke about this earlier in the discussion about common trends. Looking back on that, did you find any commonality in the way these servicemen and women were brought up, their values, experiences in life, or something like that produced this hero?
Yeah, and I talked to a number of Gold Star families too, which was extremely difficult. But again, that was their willingness to sit down with a journalist like myself and tell their stories also speaks to the courage of families who are trying to put their lives back together after losing a cherished loved one. But what I found so inspiring, if you will, or maybe just hopeful, is that these individuals come from every corner of this country. I mean, you might think, oh, they come from the Mountain West and the South, because those are places where the military is particularly popular, but that's not the case. They come from all over. And there are big cities and little communities and small villages who are creating these individuals with this value system that is extraordinary. And that should give us all some comfort. I think it gets to the comment that this is the new greatest American generation, because this country produced these extraordinary individuals. And again, it's not just them. If you read these stories, it's whole units of people. Britt Slabinski's comment to me was, when you look at the action of that day, it wasn't just my SEAL team. That was in their DNA, but it was also in the DNA of the pilots who took us up there, got shot out of the sky, and then took us back up there. It was in the DNA of the Ranger Quick Reaction Force who came up there not because they knew us, because they knew we were in trouble. And he said everyone in that battle deserved a Medal of Honor, and I kind of agreed with that. It was an extraordinary amount of courage that was displayed by everyone in that battle. So it gives me hope that there are communities around this country still producing individuals like that, and it's I draw hope from that.
As you went through that process, as you interviewed family members and recipients, did you experience any sort of hesitancy to talk about either the actions that occurred or their specific part in it, et cetera, like that? Was that a common or uncommon occurrence?
I reached out to all 25 Medal of Honor recipients from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some were happy to talk, and some didn't want to talk. And after I understood these stories, I totally respected that. As the comment was made to me more than once, this is a great honor to have this medal, but it's also a weighty burden because it reminds me of the worst day of my life. And when you read the stories and understand what they went through, that's absolutely true. And a lot of them have also been very, very forthcoming with their own struggles with post-traumatic stress. I don't even use the word disorder anymore because I think anyone who has gone through what these individuals have gone through, it's not a disorder. It's just a human nature to be traumatized by that. So yeah, there are some people, some of these recipients who are more interested in talking about it than others, but all of them were willing to stand up, be sort of singled out, and do the media interviews you do when you first receive a Medal of Honor, go to the White House. So yeah, it's a weighty burden, but that's another sign of the courage of these individuals and their willingness to use it as a platform to speak out about post-traumatic stress. So other combat veterans who are struggling with that will come forward and seek the help they need. I find also courageous.
Yeah, I mean, they are continuing to serve in a different capacity,
Exactly.
which is, again, seems to be within their character. Unfortunately, we're at that point in the program, so I get to ask the last or the official last question. You always got to have the official last question. And you and I had spoken about this a little bit. Everyone wants to talk about what's the legacy of Iraq and Afghanistan, et cetera, like that. And as I've always warned people, you can't jump to conclusions too quickly about what that means. History's got a long tenure to it. But what are these specific stories you think tell us or give us insight about what the legacy, if you want to call it that, of Iraq and Afghanistan is going to be?
Well, and I won't speak for the Medal of Honor recipients because I didn't ask them this question when I did the interviews for this book. We were still in Afghanistan. Obviously, that's happened very very recently. I have written a lot about it, as you know, and I've talked to you in some of those stories. What I always say, I mean, I hear this comment, because it was a gut-wrenching thing. No one should doubt that it was a gut-wrenching thing for people who served in Afghanistan and in Iraq to see how that ended. I mean, that was just the worst case scenario. So my heart goes out to them, and I'm asked pretty frequently, so does that mean, my service was in vain? And my comment is always the same. No, it does not mean your service was in vain. I was in Washington on 9/11 when we were attacked. I spent the next few years just doing stories on how, why, and what do we do about that, Al-Qaeda and others who want us to do us harm, other terrorist groups. And not a single terrorism expert I talked to, and I talked to scores of them, didn't think that it was inevitable that we would get attacked again with a 9/11 type spectacular. And that didn't happen for 20 years. And it didn't happen because we went over there and fought the terrorists on their home turf, kept them looking over their shoulders, kept them on their heels, decimated the leadership of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, of ISIS. All of their leadership structure has been decimated. And that kept us safe from another 9/11 type attack. So that service was not in vain by any way, shape, or form. The question going forward, the country will have to ask is, now that we're out of Afghanistan and are down to a few thousand troops in Iraq, can we do this from afar? And, time will tell.
Well, James, as usual, spending time with you has been an honor and a pleasure. And I always learn a whole lot when I speak with you about my profession. So thank you for taking the time today. But more importantly, thanks for being a great person who's been able to chronicle and tell the story of America's, and I believe, newest, greatest generation. So thank you all. And Guy, back over to you.
Well, thank you, General Perkins and Mr. Kitfield. Jim, thanks. You've really provided a service for us, especially this month, the month of November, when just last week we honored our veterans on Veterans Day. And so this discussion is very timely. I'd also like to point out just a little selfishness here that we do have Sergeant Petrie, Leroy Petrie, one of the recipients you wrote about, is on our board of directors here at AUSA. We're very proud to have Sergeant Petrie as part of our team. You've really provided a service here. I was talking to Mr. Kitfield beforehand. It's easy for all of us to just go to the archives and read the historical and official citations for these incredible acts. But what the book does is puts a real human face on these individuals, what they were thinking. You don't get that from the citation itself, where they came from, and many of the questions that General Perkins brought up. So I've read a good portion of these accounts. I'm personally knowledgeable on one of them specifically. And Jim, again, you've really captured the essence of what these great Americans have done for us. And General Perkins, as always, thank you for moderating this session. You always do this very well. We know where to find you, and we'll have you back again. So thank you for that. Before we depart this afternoon, I wanted to inform everybody about a number of upcoming events here at the Association of the United States Army. On the 23rd of November, we'll host another Thought Leaders webinar on military, community, and family issues, featuring Miss Patty Barron, formerly of AUSA, who is now serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Military, Community, and Family Policy. That ought to be very interesting on that discussion. On Pearl Harbor Day, 7th of December of this year, we'll host once again, for the first time in about a year and a half, our in-person one-day deep dive hot topic series on Army medical issues, this one on holistic health and the soldier. I think you'll enjoy that if you can join us in person on the 7th of December. On the 9th of December, we'll be back with another Thought Leaders webinar, which will be equally fascinating as the one today on Special Operations Forces, featuring three authors who've written on this topic. N.W. Collins, the author of Gray Wars, A Contemporary History of U.S. Special Operations. Ms. Jessica Donati, author of Eagle Down, The Last Special Forces Fighting in the Forever War. And Mr. Tony Brooks, the author of Leave No Man Behind, The Untold Story of the Rangers' Unrelenting Search for Marcus Luttrell, the Navy SEAL who was the lone survivor in Afghanistan. Our next noon report will be on the 13th of December, and that'll feature Command Sergeant Major Andrew Lombardo, who is the 14th Command Sergeant Major for the Army Reserve. That ought to be fascinating. And then, of course, next year we'll be approaching the Global Force Symposium in Huntsville, Alabama, again, for the first time in a year or so in person, 29 to 31 March in Huntsville. We're really excited to get back to the Huntsville and Redstone Arsenal community. They are always great hosts for the Global Force Symposium, one of AUSA's most important professional development forums. These are just some of the many events and speakers that we have coming up in the remainder of this year and early in next year. We hope you can join us for any or all of these events. You can find out more information about these events and registering for them at our website at ausa.org. And finally, we want to thank all of you for your membership in AUSA. Membership matters. We can't do these events. We can't advocate for the Army, for our soldiers, without your membership. So if your membership is out of date or you are thinking about joining the U.S. Army's Professional Association, again, go to ausa.org for more information. And again, thank you to Mr. Kitfield. Thank you to General Perkins. And we appreciate your attendance and have a great Army Day.